Hey, Lead Up listeners, Mike Harbour, another great episode of the Lead Up podcast. I'm really excited. This is an interview podcast like we do every other week. I'm excited to introduce Glenn Parker to you today. Glenn is in the same business that I am, in the business of helping people. He's the author of 17 books. We're going to talk about one of those today. The title of his latest book is Positive Influence, the leader who helps people become their best self. I love that subtitle, Glenn, because one of my favorite quotes in leadership and how I try to model my leadership is an old quote from Jack Welch. He said, when you were made a leader, you weren't given a crown. You were given the responsibility to bring out the best in people. And I'm
People.
sure your book is focused around bringing out the best in people based on your subtitle.
No
Glenn,
doubt.
welcome to the Lead Up podcast.
Thanks very much. Looking forward to our conversation, Mike. Let's do it.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm passionate about leadership. Glenn, I've been recording podcasts for almost 6 years now, and out of the 400 plus episodes that we've recorded, 90% of them are focused on leadership. And I talk a lot about teamwork and communication and mindset, the mindset of a leader as well. But in your book, you talk about positive influence. One of my mentors is John Maxwell. You know, he kind of says leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. I'd love for you to define positive influence for us. What does that mean to you as the way you've written about it in your book?
Well, let me tell you a story. Okay, actually it's my story about a person who was a positive influence on me when I was a very young person. It's actually my first job out of grad school, my first boss, Larry, and we're coming up on my first performance appraisal. Woo! So I knew what was coming because I got the form and I kind of filled it out. And I'm meeting with Larry, and um, we get to a point in the performance appraisal where they ask you, what are your career goals? What do you want to do next in your development as a person in this organization? So Larry asked me that question, and I said to him, "Well, I'm not." And by the way, I just should tell you about what I did. I was a researcher. I was kind of nerdy. I just would look up things and write reports, and I'd look up other things and write more reports, and that's kind of what I did. And it was, I thought I was good at it, but everybody can, people can be good at boring, and I was actually quite good at it. And so I said, but the people across the hall in leadership training seem to be having all the fun. They were traveling all over the country, conducting workshops and coming back with stories and all kinds of things about people they met and things they did. And I said, I think I might like to try that. So I was wondering, as part of my plan, could I sit in on a leadership training workshop and observe and see what they do? So Larry says, well, Glenn, as a matter of fact, I'm going down south next week and I'm going to do a couple of workshops in two different cities. Why don't you come with me? I said, oh, that would be great. Um, and he said, but there's just one thing. I really can't justify your travel expenses unless you teach something.
Mm.
So I go, Larry, and my lips start to quiver,
Mm.
Larry, what would I teach? I don't know anything. He said, don't worry about it. We'll figure something out. And he did. And I went with him and we did the 2-day workshop. And Mike, what he could have done, and what some people would have done, is he would say, here's my slides, here's my notes. Why don't you prep and why don't you do the workshop? And I'll sit in the back of the room and I'll give you feedback. No, he didn't do that. He gave me a 2-hour segment to do on the afternoon of the second day.
Mm.
So he had already kind of warmed up the crowd and things
Mhm.
were going really well. And I came in and I did my 2 hours and it actually went well. Here's one of the key things that Larry did. And by the way, I didn't realize what he was doing at the time. On reflection, years later, I realized what he was doing. He was positioning me for success. He
Mm,
put me in a position to be successful by where I was on the program and what he asked me to teach. And I came back from that experience. I did it twice and I went, this is what I want to do. So he basically changed the trajectory of my career. I said, this is where I want to go. And what he did, and this is one of the key things about a positive influence leader, Mike, is that he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself.
mm,
He saw something in me. He felt that I could do it. He knew that I could do it. And he put me in a position to be successful. And
mm.
that's one of the critical things. I'm kind of giving you two things there. One is he saw something in me, and that's what positive influence leaders do. And he also positioned me for success. So that's part of that's part of what a positive influence leader does. And it stayed with me for my entire life.
I love that. You took me right back to when I was 24 years old, Glenn, and I was in the Army and I wanted to be a leader. I thought I was a leader, but I really wasn't. I was just kind of a bully, right? I was loud. I'm assertive. I'm a high D on the disc. I'm a type A. Army worked really well for me in some ways, but there was a couple of leaders. I never, up until that point, Glenn, I had graduated high school and 4 years of college, and I was educated, but I'd never read a book up until that point. I did the Cliff Notes, the table of contents, just enough to get by. But I had a leader like you just described, and it took me right back there. I had two leaders, matter of fact. And one of them gave me a book called Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. It's the first book I ever read. I fell in love with personal growth at that point and then leadership. And I had another leader that did almost the exact thing
No kidding.
your leader did. It put me in front of a group that was his group. He was a civilian, but at that time, he put me in front of a group to teach as part of his program he was teaching. And up until that point, Glenn, I had taken F's in speech class because I'm scared to death to speak in front of people. But he put me in a place to be successful, right? And that really kind of launched. I mean, that truly is 30 plus years later put me where I'm at today, right? It kind of started that trajectory. And since then, I've read hundreds of books. I've written 3 books. I've done hundreds of podcasts. I've interviewed tens of thousands of people in my life, worked with thousands and thousands of leaders. And it's all back to that kind of that one or two leaders that you just described. It took me right back there. And I've thought about that before, but not in the same way. I love that. So, once you let's talk about this, and again, this is not really the questions that we discussed talking, but I'd love for our leaders to understand this, our listeners. Once you have been placed in that position by a positive influence leader, what did you then do to grow your own positive influence? Let's talk about that, because that's where I think leaders need to go today.
To influence other people.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that what you're saying? Yeah. So one of the things that we say, and it's a big part of, how I live my life, is pay it forward.
Mm,
The really effective positive influence leaders pay it forward. They're always looking for ways to help other people become a positive influence leader. And when we did the research for being a positive influence leader, we asked people, what did you do? Can you give us
mm,
an example of people that that you met along the way that you influenced? And many of them could tell a specific story. Others said they couldn't recall a specific story or didn't want to share a specific story, but they said generally this is what I do. I'm always to looking out for someone else. People call it mentoring. Always wanted to be a mentor. I wanted to be helpful, and but paying it forward is one of the characteristics of a positive influence leader. So what you're saying is, I believe, is right on target and certainly consistent with our research.
Yeah, it's good. So, in your book, Positive Influence, you identify the four types of positive influence leaders. Can you tell our listeners what those four types are and just briefly describe them before we go into some more detail about positive influence?
Well, I'll tell you briefly how we got there, because what we call our research is sort of bottoms up. We had this idea about what is a positive influence leader, and we went in and we started asking people, because I think in the back of our mind, although we had not written this down, we had this idea of we would come up with a description, almost like a job description of what is a positive influence leader. We were looking for maybe behavioral characteristics. What is it exactly that they do? And we just opened the book and we asked people this open-ended question, and they started throwing things back to us. And as we took this all in, and at the end, when we had already interviewed 45 or 50 people, we sat down and looked at what do we got?
Mm-hmm.
And what we didn't have was a profile, because that's what I thought what the we thought the outcome would be. It wasn't a profile. It was that you can be a positive influence leader in a number of different ways, all of them helpful, but different. And
Mm-hmm.
so we ended up identifying four different types or four different styles of positive influence leaders. So we called them supportive, the teacher, the motivator, and the role model. So the supportive person is the one that says, Mike, I got your back. I can help you. You can do this. I'm with you. I can support what you want to do. I won't do it for you, but I will help you do that. It's like the when you were a little kid, the first time you tried to ride a two-wheeler, your dad says, here's how you do it. I'll get you up on the wheel. I'll give you a push, but you got to take it from there. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the supportive type. I'm here for you. I have your back. The teacher, and we're actually starting to do more research in depth on what does it take, what does a positive influence teacher do? Um, and I maybe want to talk to some people in later on in your audience about maybe participating in the research in this, maybe interviewing them. But the teacher is someone who teaches you what you need to know in order to be your best self, what you need to know in order to be an effective leader.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they teach you when you work in an organization about how to get things done, how to be successful in the organization. They teach you about the culture. Here's something that if you want to be successful in this organization, do this, but don't do that. You want to get something done. Oh, you want to do a loose leaf binder for a presentation? There's a protocol in the manual on how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk to Jim down in the print shop, he'll get it done for you and get it done exactly the way you want it. So the teacher teaches you values, teaches you knowledge, teaches you skills, teaches you how to be an effective leader. Um, the motivator is somebody, this is what Larry was to me. I didn't know this at the time, but I recognized later. I said, that's what Larry did. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and he put me in a position to be successful. And what in the end result, he helped me find my purpose in life.
Mm-hmm.
He helped me find my true north. This is the way you should go. And I went from there and I didn't stop. The last, we suddenly realized also that a lot of people learn from watching other people.
Mm-hmm.
My son is like that. He learns a lot by watching other people. And um, and very often those people are someone you know. Your first boss, you watch and you see how he does it or she does it. and or you watch someone do a job the correct way, you learn from watching a role model. And the other thing is that very often role models are people that you have never met, because we have these people who are role models that are significant people. I'm a big sports fan, as you know, and so Michael Jordan is a role model to several generations of basketball players. But
Mm-hmm.
the really smart ones, Mike, don't try to copy his jump shot. What they do is they copy his work ethic.
Right.
First one in the gym in the morning, last one to leave at night, won't leave until he can make 90 out of 100 foul shots.
Mm.
That's what they do. And Oprah Winfrey has talked about Maya Angelou as a role model for her. Many famous people will talk about famous people who were role models to them, people that they watch and look and learn from. So those are the four types: supportive, a teacher, motivator, role model. And by the
So
way,
it,
you can be more than one.
yeah,
So
that was going to be my next question. Does somebody have to be all of them? Are they good at one and not the other?
okay,
What does that look like?
that's a great question. The really effective positive influence leader is situational. Have
Mm.
you heard that expression before?
Yeah.
Situational leadership? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They're situational. So they look at a situation and say, what what's needed right now for this team, for this group, for this person? And they do it. They
Mm-hmm.
don't say, well, I'm not a role model, therefore I can't help this person. No, they flex to what's needed at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we would ultimately call, is a little bit pretentious, but a transformational leader, somebody who can transform a person, a situation, by doing what's necessary, what that person needs at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Have that kind of flexibility. And we, by the way, developed a a self-assessment instrument that people can fill out. It's got 18 items, and you get a score for each of the four items.
Mm-hmm.
And that tells you what we call your primary leadership style is. But it doesn't mean it's the only thing you can do, but it's kind of the easy thing for you. It's your go-to at times. But the really effective leader knows that they better be able to do all four when the situation calls for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Or have someone else know your strength, right? Work in your strength zone. If you're a teacher, be a teacher, but have someone else on your team that you empower to be the supporter, the motivator, the role model, if that's not a
Right.
strength for you. I think that's what great leaders are able to do, is recognize where their strength zone is. Yes, you need to operate in all four of those, I believe, but sometimes, we're not like, I'd probably say, if I were judging myself, like assessing myself without taking your self assessment yet, my weakest would probably be the supportive leader, right? I'm a great teacher. I can motivate. I'm a good role model, but I'm not always. I don't always slow down enough to be supportive, right? I just okay, Glenn, go, you got it. And I'm not maybe that supporter behind that at times, because I'm very task oriented. I want to go get things done. So if
Right.
someone wanted to take that self-assessment, is there access to that in your book? Like if they get a copy of your book, is there
Yes,
access to that self-assessment?
it's in the yes, it is in the back of the book. Our publisher, HRD Press, has published it in a separate booklet, so
Okay.
that it makes it a lot easier than trying to fold back the book to do it. And you can also do it as part of a team building exercise. So everybody
Sure.
in the team fills it out, and they compare and look and say, "Oh, that's what you are. Oh, maybe we need to work together." To your point,
Hmm.
to be more collaborative, to get sort of to get things done.
Yeah,
But
that's good.
and by the way, when they fill it out, they at the end they also um, do a personal development exercise, which says, okay, this is where I am right now. Where do I want to be? So,
Mm-hmm.
so Mike, you would say, well, I'd like to bring up my strength as a supportive leader. What can I do to do that? So I
Mm-hmm.
come up with some ideas, and then, what would be a good idea is to sit down, and maybe you can do this in a team building offsite where you sit down with some other people and they give you some ideas about how you could bring up that strength and be more well-rounded as a positive influence leader.
That's good. Yeah. So, Lead Up listeners, make sure you go to Amazon and find Glenn's books. Glenn and Michael Parker. Is Michael your son, Glenn? Is
Yes,
co-author with you? So Michael
yes.
Parker, Glenn Parker, Positive Influence. Make sure you get a copy of it so that you can get access to that assessment. Glenn, you wrote, you started writing this book during the pandemic. Um, Crisis mode leadership, right? I do most of the work that I do is in the healthcare space. I work a lot of different industries, but about 80% or more of my training, coaching, consulting business is in the healthcare space.
Mhm.
Obviously, it was major crisis in
Yes,
healthcare,
yes.
right? What and I think we're still kind of in chaos mode of maybe not crisis mode, but certainly chaos mode. What did you learn in your research about some of those challenges leaders face in leading through crisis, and how does your research, your tools, your book help someone lead better and more effectively in those moments?
Well, okay, so that's a large one. Let me talk about. Let's
Mm-hmm.
break it down a little bit and talk about what were some of the biggest challenges.
Yeah.
Uh, and we did interview the CEO of a major hospital, so we have some of that data. We interviewed the CEOs of a couple of real estate companies that were obviously hard hit. That either they were in terms of office space, but also they managed shopping centers and malls. Um, and a number of other hospitality, hotels and restaurants and so on. One of the biggest challenge, I would say, from what we learned, is the emotional toll that it took on everybody. It,
Mm-hmm.
and at first, people, I don't think, recognized it that much because they were dealing with, understanding it, looking at the development of the vaccine, a way of diagnosing and identifying people who had it or didn't have it. There was there was a big information gap when they first started, and so there was no treatment for it, and so that raises a lot of emotion on the part of people who have to deal with it. And from dealing with people in healthcare, they were some of the hardest hit people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the biggest things that leaders told us is that initially they felt like they had to be the strong one. They had to be large and in charge. And
Mm-hmm.
after a while, they realized this was really difficult for them. That there was the real emotional toll on them, and they suddenly realized that that's a big emotional toll on the people in the organization. And so they, um, and then we had this people started working remotely. Now in
Mm-hmm.
hospitals, of course, they couldn't do it in restaurants and a lot of things, but in many places they could start to. And suddenly we've got this idea of remote work,
Mm-hmm.
and it just fell upon us. And we felt, okay, well, that will really help with the stress. It actually added to the stress
Yeah.
because everybody's home. Mom's home, dad's home, the kids are home.
Mm-hmm.
And the days, because you didn't have commutes, people said, oh, it must be a lot better. You don't have that crazy commute to work and back, but they know where to get you. They can find
Yeah.
you at any time. And so
Mm-hmm.
suddenly people were working 12-hour days because you were always available. You couldn't say, well, I was in transit or there was no Wi-Fi and I could, no, you were home. And so
Mm-hmm.
the days never seemed to end. So you had that. On top of that, the kids were home from school. and they were struggling with doing homework remotely. And you had all this stress on the family. And then, gee, are we going to have a job? So there was all this financial stress that people at home were hit with. So there was a lot of this emotion that was going on that created a lot of stress for people. And adding to that, because we all remember what was going on in the country, you had the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd that erupted into hundreds of thousands of people in demonstrations in cities around the country. Now, not coincidentally, many of those people who were very upset about what went on worked for many of these many companies. And suddenly the leaders of those companies had to deal with what was going on outside that impacted the employees in their company. And let me just give you a couple of things that happened, Mike, specifically during this time, because leaders had to deal with it. And here's a couple of things I thought that were pretty interesting that we learned in our research. Eric Nordstrom, who was the CEO of Nordstrom, the department store, the clothing store, he actually flew to Florida to meet with local police after one of his employees was mistreated by local police officers. He dealt with the situation. He made a big statement there by backing his one employee, and the whole company, of course, knew about this. So he stepped up big time as a leader. And then he also had, after that, an open meeting with all African American employees of Nordstrom, and they talked about what was on their mind. And then also another CEO, Hans Vestberg of Verizon, he also had an all hands meeting with employees in which he said, talking about what went on in the streets and with the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, he said, "This is not acceptable in America." And he started to cry. And I was told about this in one of our interviews, and they said, this is on YouTube. And I went and looked at it on YouTube, and here's a CEO of a company crying because again, the emotional toll on them. It was absolutely extraordinary. Here's a creative solution that one of the CEOs did, Jody McLean of Edens. Edens is a major real estate company that owns and operates a number of malls and shopping centers. She sent out to everyone in the company a copy of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And she set up small groups of 10 employees with a facilitator to just unload. What are you feeling now? What's going on right now? So things don't get bottled up and people turn to social media where there's all kinds of conspiracy theories and the like floating around. They kept it within the company, and they showed that the company cared about what was going on and cared about them. And that was a big part of what people did to address the whole idea. And so out of this idea of the challenges of dealing with the emotionality, which was predominant during this time, the leaders felt that they had to communicate more effectively with their employees. And it sounds, oh, well, big deal. They had to communicate. That's what they do all the time. It was a lot harder during that time, a lot harder, because the information was not so readily available. And for many leaders, they don't feel comfortable, or they didn't feel comfortable, or they had to get comfortable with. They don't feel comfortable unless they have complete information. I'm not going to give a report to employees. I'm not going to have an all hands meeting unless I'm absolutely positive that this is correct. Well, that was not going to happen because things were changing. And so, for example, I love this quote. This is from one of the leaders that we interviewed. He works in the power plant industry, which of course they know a heck of a lot about crisis. Rob Zimmerman, he said, you can't be paralyzed. Listen to this, Mike. You can't be paralyzed by the fear of giving the wrong answer. We had to get comfortable with this is what we know today, but stay
Mm-hmm.
tuned. Things may change tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And people had to get comfortable as a leader saying things like that. And you didn't want to get in a position of, you know, deceiving, deflecting, minimizing, sugarcoating. People wanted the truth because if you weren't going to give it to them, they were going to go find it someplace else. And
Yeah.
you maybe didn't want them going there. You didn't want them going to these crazy conspiracy sites, were floating all kinds of dopey ideas about the vaccine and about the stress of organizations. You didn't want that sort of thing. So leaders really had to get out there and communicate. And from working in healthcare, they got out of their offices and they were walking the floors of the hospital. And the
Yeah.
real good ones, right?
Yeah. Yeah, communication to your point, the change. So many of my clients, I mean, things would change every hour, right? They give instruction and they get new information. And so it was constant change. And most people are change averse, like they don't desire change. They like stability. And and in leaders, when you talk about communication, leaders are really good at communicating about, goals and vision and budget statements and expenses and those kind of things, but not good at getting down to an emotional level where they had to go during that time, as you described. So, yeah, that supportive leader, that role model leader that you talk about in your book are important. I'm sure, Glenn, we
Yeah,
could
I'm
talk.
gonna I'm gonna just follow
Yeah.
up because we're sort of aligned on the healthcare thing. The CEO of the hospital that I interviewed, he was walking the floors every day.
Hmm.
By the way, it wasn't so easy to even to get around through the floors because there were beds out in the hallway because they didn't have enough rooms for all the COVID patients. They went from
Hmm.
like in 2 weeks, they went from 10 patients to 90 patients. And
Hmm.
that was and so he would stop employees along the way, everybody that he encountered, and say, "How are you doing? How can I help? What do you need?"
Hmm.
And people would, one of the things, of course, they were saying, we need N95 masks. Well, they weren't so easy to get. So he had said, look, they're, they're not easy to get. We're working on it. When we get them, you'll get them. But please talk to me. If you need something, talk to me. And he was doing this all the time. At the same time, by the way, he's he's not so he's not so brave himself. He admitted, yeah, I was scared too. I was scared I was going to get COVID. I was
Hmm.
scared if I was going I would get COVID and I didn't know I had it and I'd be bringing it home to my family. And it was but that's the ones that really did it well were out there. You remember the old days? Remember management by walking around? It's
Oh
coming
yeah.
back. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so he was doing it. We interviewed the COO of Amtrak, the rail company, and he was walking the platforms and riding the trains and talking to people, talking to conductors and saying, "How are you doing? What do you need?" And he had one interesting thing. I'm sorry, I get revved up here because it's really it was an emotional time, and they really people unloaded and were very happy to talk to us. He said, you had to wear masks on the if you rode the train, just like you did on the airplanes. And we always heard about unruly behavior on flights, but there was unruly behavior on trains also. People wouldn't wear a mask. So he was smart. He said to the conductors, do not just tell them what the rule is, but you don't get into any altercations with them. Let them sit there. What you do is you go to the other passengers and you say, if you're not comfortable sitting here in this car, you can move to the next car or move to another seat in this car, and I'll help you do that. So they were out there problem solving and answering questions. And what does that do with the employees? How do the employees feel? These guys are out there, they care about us, and they're
Hmm.
trying to do something. They're not sitting up there in their executive offices, sending out emails. They're out here talking and communicating with us.
Yeah, the best way to be a positive influencer, right, is connect with your people. I've got a tactic in my book that I wrote, Quit Losing Talent, that's, called C squared rounding, and it really, it's just another, term for manage by walking around, but really getting connected to your people, showing them that you value them, those types of things. Glenn, we could probably talk for a couple of hours about leadership, positive influence, the four types of leadership.
Would love
I try,
to.
I try to keep I try to keep my shows to about 40 minutes. We've kind of hit that mark, but tell the lead up listeners how they can connect with you, how they can get a copy of your book,
Oh,
and learn more about positive influence.
yes. Our book, the second book, is called Positive Influence: Leadership in a Time of Crisis. It's about what leaders did to deal with the COVID-19 crisis and what they learned going forward.
Hmm.
What they can carry with them going forward, into less stressful times, not stress-free times, but less stressful times. Um, so that book actually won an award, a business book award, the Goody Business Book Award, in what they say was their most competitive category. So we're quite proud of that. So let me say this to your listeners, because your audience are people who are leaders and aspiring leaders. I will
Hmm.
be glad to send to the first 5 people that send me an email a complimentary signed copy of that book. If you email me at Glenn at thepositiveinfluenceleader.com, that's Glenn, Glenn, at thepositiveinfluenceleader.com. I will send you a signed um, complimentary copy of that book to the first 5 people that I hear from.
Love that. Yeah, send send an email to Glenn at thepositiveinfluenceleader.com. Mention that you heard him on the Lead Up podcast so he knows where you heard his message today. And just say, hey, Glenn, send me a copy of that great book you wrote called The Positive Influencer. And he'll send you that copy as well. We'll add the link to Glenn's website and his email in the show notes. So if you're listening to this, make sure you visit the show notes. You can just copy and paste that link. Glenn, thank you for the book that you've written. Thank you for what you've done. A lifetime of leadership development and being a positive influencer yourself. And thanks for being a great guest on the Lead Up podcast.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyed our conversation, Mike. Let's stay in touch.
Right on.